when forensic interviewing started, it really wasn't even called forensic interviewing. I think some of the earliest really documented areas here we came at the McMartin preschool case, the famous case from out in California that there was a movie made about. And when there was allegations that these kids have been sexually abused, people were like, well, these are little kids, like 3 and 4 years old. Who can talk to these kids? Like police officers like, I'm not going to do that. And they thought, well, you know what? Why don't we get therapists that work with kids? They're used to talking to these kids. They can engage with them. Why don't we find some of them? And so some of the earliest documentation of interviewing children was actually these very well-intentioned therapists, who were working with kids. This is before evidence-based practice. This is before any of the published research on forensic interviewing. They were going off of their guts and trying to do the best they can without really having science or practice to guide them. And so they made mistakes, right? I mean, they weren't intentional mistakes. It was just like we didn't know what we didn't know. And that really started to spark some of the resistance to forensic interviewing that we've seen in the courts over the years about, oh my gosh, you're using these techniques. Are these appropriate? Is this reliable memory? Are we inducing memory? Are we retrieving memory in an appropriate manner? And then, we started to see these pockets around the U.S. of people who started to develop their programs and forensic interviewing models that were a little bit disparate. And, one looked very different than another. They were trying to do the best they can. More research gets published, more practice, people really starting to share ideas. And what we've done is we've kind of over time now come together where while we still have different forensic interview protocols, they're much more alike. And I think people are agreeing much, much more on the science than historically was the case, where there were very disparate approaches. And, we still get some research that's coming in and helping further refine that. But, it was oftentimes police officers and CPS workers who were being tasked to do these interviews, especially when CACs were just getting started and like, hey, we got one person to turn the lights on and make sure everything's working. But the investigators either A, didn't want to give up control of their interview, their kid, or they, said, I guess I'll do it. And effectively, we were asking them to do two jobs at once. They had to be both the investigator and the interviewer. And people began to say, well, what if we had someone who really specialized in doing these interviews? Like they did them all the time on a regular basis, and they got really good at it. And that's where we started to see this idea of a child forensic interview specialist come around. And if over the last decade, we've really seen that ramp up in the role of CACs, where I think a tremendous number of interviews now are being done by these child forensic interview specialists. So it's been the development of a profession, not something that different people do, like a task people do. It's now become a specialty where you can actually have a career as a forensic interview specialist. And I think, the story at many CACs is probably like at ours, which is our detectives at first were somewhat concerned. They were worried about the integrity of their case. And over time, when they see it, now they're like, nobody's interviewing my kid except for, Kim or Andra or Kate or Linda, like they are very protective of those. And they see the value because it's done all the time. I guess it's kind of equates to what we've seen with medical professionals, Sarah. Right? It's not just going to any old doctor. You need to go to a doctor who really specializes and understands and has the equipment and the training and the background necessary to do an appropriate medical examination of a child when there's allegations of abuse, not just going to any doctor. Similarly, I think another thing is, we do it all the time with crime scene. We all know from our own experience or watching TV that if there's a crime scene, the first thing an officer does is check for the safety of anybody there and make sure that, anybody that needs immediate care is, taken care of. And then the next big job is to secure that scene, right? Because you don't want anybody messing up that scene until who shows up, until they call crime scene. And the crime scene comes in, and that way we're protecting the evidence. And that means the evidence that we secure through the crime scene is the best evidence that we may have, and it can really help us solve a crime. That applies in child forensic interviewing, in as much as in the crime scene for child sexual abuse is oftentimes the child's brain. And we don't want anybody coming in there messing with that or whatever. Best to wait and have a trained forensic interviewer be the person to be the crime scene tech that really explores that evidence and helps create develop that evidence, during the forensic interview.